Sunday's game against the Baltimore Ravens is the Denver Broncos' biggest test yet of this season. What is the player's mindset going into Sunday's game against Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry? We'll break that down and take a look at the state of the AFC on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for making us your first listen of the day. Every single day. We appreciate you so much there. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined as always by Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com, and Broncos Country. Here's what you can expect on today's episode of the show. We're going to take a look at the state of the AFC West. Obviously, Kansas City is the top of the division right now. The Broncos, they're not too far back, especially with some big, important games coming up right here. We'll also glance at the rest of the AFC after Week 8. But we'll kick things off here today by talking about the Broncos' biggest test of the season. That is Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, the Baltimore Ravens. A tough matchup on the road here for Denver as they begin a 2-game road trip. You'll get that here on today's episode of the show, brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel. And you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. And new customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Sayre, my friend, Baltimore Ravens, Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, road matchup, Eastern time zone game. It doesn't get any bigger than that, and some big AFC implications at stake for the outcome of this game. This game right here on Sunday is the Broncos' biggest test of the season.
Who would have thought that going into this game, the Broncos and the Ravens would have the same record? I mean, right? That's kind of crazy to think about. The Broncos at 5-3, the Ravens at 5-3. I know that the NFL is tough on everyone, but we kind of assumed going into this year, at least I did, and maybe some of you listening did as well, that the Ravens would probably be, closer to 7-1, 6-2 at worst at this point in the season. And here we are. They have the same record as the Denver Broncos. Obviously, going into Baltimore is a tough test no matter what the Ravens record is, but especially the later into the season. So it's kind of fortunate for the Broncos that right here, kind of smack dab in the middle of the year, that they're going to Baltimore, even coming off a loss. I've been saying it the last week plus that, man, I don't want to face the Ravens coming off of a loss because, that's not a team that's going to lose 2 in a row very often. But at the same time, I think that the Cleveland Browns, oddly enough, out of all teams, that of what we've seen the Browns this season, kind of helped expose some weaknesses on this Ravens team that maybe the Broncos can take advantage of in terms of the chess match of this game. Obviously, the folks over at FanDuel, they don't like the Broncos' chances at all in this game, but it's going to be an interesting situation for this whole roster because last year the Broncos played spoiler. They were upsetting teams as far as like, hey, nobody thinks you guys are any good anyway. This time around, now they're right up there. They're one of the only 5 teams in the AFC right now, Cody, with 5 or more wins. So it's a lot of pressure on this young Broncos team.
Yeah, and look, obviously you're facing Lamar Jackson, who Denver has struggled against, in the last handful of years. I remember there was one game in particular, I think it was Vic Fangio when he was the head coach, and the game plan was, hey, we're going to dare Lamar Jackson to beat us with his arm. What did he do? He and Hollywood Brown went crazy against the Broncos defense in that game. And then obviously, there was a game he got hurt a couple of years ago where Denver, they lost a close one on the road there. A game that they should have won because, Justin Simmons had 2 interceptions in that game here. I'm curious because Denver's obviously played better on the road here, but you look at the personnel that Baltimore has outside of just Lamar Jackson and obviously Derrick Henry, but they got Mark Andrews still. They got Isaiah Likely. They got 2 really good tight ends, but they also have a really good receiving core right now as well, led by Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, and they even have Nelson Aguilar in the mix there. This is a Ravens offense that has big play explosive capability, and they've kind of been this team that one week they look like they're in a dogfight, right? Or if they've gotten a big lead on somebody, then they let these guys creep back in. Like, for example, the Dallas Cowboys almost came back from the massive deficit they were in, almost beat the Baltimore Ravens. But then they go on and they mollywop the Buffalo Bills in primetime action in one of those games. And it's like, man, okay, we're trying to figure out who this Ravens team is. And then last week, you see them struggle against the Cleveland Browns. Obviously, they lose to a 1-6 football team. And all of a sudden, now I'm looking at this match. I'm like, okay, hey, Denver's coming off of a win. They beat a team that they should have beaten. Now they're facing a Ravens team who is coming off of a disappointing loss, and they're probably going to have a little bit more hunger in their bellies this week. It's going to make it for a bigger matchup. Right now, Denver's got the tiebreaker over them due to conference record. Now this is an even bigger matchup for Denver because you win this game against Baltimore. Well, now you hold the tiebreaker scenario over them. Maybe later on down the season, it is a huge game here. And Broncos cornerback Patrick Surtain, we got to catch up with him. Obviously, it's Sunday in the locker room, really kind of touching ahead, a little bit of focus on, hey, what's coming up here in terms of your mentality as a team, especially with these 2 road games that are coming up. Here's what Pat had to say.
Yeah, we gotta we understand the task at hand. I mean, it's NFL football, so we feel like every week is a new week of opportunity. And obviously, with these 2 weeks coming up, we know the opponents that we're facing, and we got a good opportunity to really make our mark.
So how do you leave your mark here, Sayre? Like as a team who's now 5-3, people didn't have high expectations of Denver coming into the season, but Denver's playing really good football right now. Obviously, there's some things that they're going to have to clean up. You can't make the same mistakes, I think, defensively or offensively that you've made through the early part of the season against a team like Baltimore, because you turn the ball over offensively. Baltimore's a team that could capitalize and score because they have explosive capability. And not to mention, it's like, all right, now the Ravens, they like to go a little bit more under center now with Lamar because then they can just hand off downhill to Derrick Henry. But then Lamar could fake the handoff and keep it on to the outside. So not only do you have to account for edge contain, but your interior run defense has to be big. And then you have to be able to stop some of the explosive playmakers they have. This truly is the Broncos' biggest test of the season, not just defensively, but even for, the Ravens offensively as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think if you're the Denver Broncos in this game, like somebody said it when we were on a BR stream the other day, Cody, they said it feels like the Broncos are kind of playing with house money a little bit. This is one of those games where I feel like you're playing with house money a little bit. Like, yes, the stakes are high. Yes, there's playoff implications potentially down the line if you look back at this game and say, hey, there's a tiebreaker here or there, especially with the Steelers playing as well as they are and the Ravens being a wild card team currently. But what I think really we need to see from the Broncos in this game is like, you belong in this type of game, win or lose. Like if the Broncos go out there and just lay flat, Cody, and they look absolutely like they okay, this is the team that everybody was talking about before the season. This is one of the worst rosters in the league. This is obviously Bo Nix, turnover prone. The last week was just the Carolina Panthers, kind of a little bit of an outlier type of deal. Like if that's how the Broncos come out in this game against Baltimore, I think that's going to be the national narrative for most of the year. But if they can come out in this game, win or lose, and prove that they belong in this type of game, like go toe to toe with the Baltimore Ravens, and even if it's like a last team that has the ball wins kind of a situation, I think proving that you belong with Jim Nantz and Tony Romo and Tracy Wolfson, the whole CBS crew that's going to be calling this game. Like the Broncos don't get Jim Nantz games anymore. He called pretty much every Peyton Manning game, and now they barely ever see the guy, right? And so this is going to be one of those situations to where, yes, it's in the early window. Most of the games are being played in the early window this week, but this is a game, an opportunity for the Broncos to really stand out and prove that they belong in bigger games like Sean Payton said they were going to play in.
When we had our conference call with Mike McGlinchey early on in the week on Monday, one of the things he told us, said, we want to prove that we're a team that can play on the big stage. We have to play big in big moments. We want to show that. We want to prove it to ourselves. I think that's going to be a big thing to follow, and it doesn't get any bigger than Lamar Jackson, the Baltimore Ravens, a team that was in the AFC playoffs last year that was a favorite at one point to maybe go win it all, and then they ran into some trouble in the postseason. This is a huge game at a crucial juncture of the season. If this was an early season game, okay, we say, it was early on in the year, but now you're almost at the halfway point of the year. This is big. It doesn't get any bigger than this, and all the action kicks off on Sunday, 11 o'clock a.m. Mountain Time for all you Colorado folks out there. But what does the AFC look like? Not only just for the Denver Broncos, but across the AFC landscape. We'll take a look at the state of the AFC here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's show is brought to you by Bilt Rewards. And listen up, renters. Ever feel like you're stuck in this loop of rent payments, just watching your money vanish into thin air? Well, it's time to turn that rent game around and start earning some serious rewards. That's where Bilt Rewards comes in handy. Bilt is breaking ground as a neighborhood rewards program that hooks you up with points on your rent every month. Pay your rent and watch the Bilt points roll in. Use points to jet off on a dream vacation. Put your points toward a flight or hotel stay with 500 plus airlines and 700,000 plus hotels and properties. You can also use your points to book fitness studio classes, redeem them toward a future rent payment. They're designed to meet your lifestyle. Pay rent hassle-free through the Bilt Rewards app. Your rent game just got a major upgrade. Bilt points have been consistently ranked the highest value point currency by the Points Guy and Bankrate. So sign up today and earn points by paying rent right now when you go to joinbilt.com/lockedonnfl. That's JOINBILT.com/lockedonnfl. Make sure to use our URL so they know that we sent you. Joinbilt.com/lockedonnfl to start earning points with your rent payments today.
The Denver Broncos are one of just a handful of teams in the AFC with 5 or more wins here after Week 8 action. Cody and I are going to break down the current state of the AFC and what it means for the Denver Broncos going forward as far as their playoff aspirations this season. But Broncos Country, thanks so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. You know, Cody and Sayre will be here for you, whatever goes down with the Broncos, especially as we get towards the trade deadline. Never know when an emergency episode of the show is going to drop. So subscribe if you haven't already done so. Cody, let's talk about the state of the AFC right now. We kind of do our weekly breakdown of what went down across the AFC. Of course, the Kansas City Chiefs. Unfortunately for Broncos fans, the Chiefs are still on top of the AFC. I have a little bit of a hot take about the Kansas City Chiefs, Cody. I think despite the fact that they're back-to-back Super Bowl champions and that they're undefeated right now, they've got to be the least intriguing undefeated back-to-back Super Bowl champion that ever has been. Like the Chiefs just aren't the same type of level of must-see TV. I think I've gotten so used to them being this way. Maybe that's what it is, just white noise at this point for the Kansas City Chiefs, but they remain on top of the AFC with a little bit of a pad, a little bit of a cushion right now.
Yeah, I mean, obviously 7-0. The nearest team there is the Houston Texans coming in as the second seed right now with a 6-2 record. I mean, you got 3 teams who are sitting 6-2 right now. You've got a couple teams here. Obviously, 2 teams at 5-3 with Denver. The Chargers there at 4-3. Kansas City coming off of a win on the road against the Las Vegas Raiders, where it was close for a good portion of the game, and then obviously Kansas City found a way to pull it off late at the end, and they're finding ways to win. Once again, like that's the mark of a good team. Unfortunately, as painful as it is they're not playing their best football, and they're still winning, and they're still undefeated. Obviously, they're going to play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week, and obviously we know that situation down there in Tampa. There's a lot of injuries. No Chris Godwin, no Mike Evans. That one is going to be very intriguing because that one's going to be in Kansas City. And then next week, they'll face the Denver Broncos, which I think we're excited to see how the Broncos maybe stack up against KC this year. Houston, obviously is always an interesting team. Obviously with CJ Stroud, the way that they're playing right now, they're still finding ways to win. And they even haven't looked their best, but they have a 5-0 conference record right now, which is obviously where you want to be. Like your conference games are going to matter the most here. They're taking care of business, and obviously they're tied for second right now with the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are obviously 6-2. They're coming off a victory on Monday Night Football against the New York Giants. And for a while, it was 9-9, I think, going into halftime. But we know how good Pittsburgh's defense is. Their conference record is 4-1 right now as it currently stands. And then right below them at number 4, right above Denver, it's the Buffalo Bills, 6-2. Josh Allen still has not committed a turnover in terms of throwing an interception. I think he had a fumble in week 1. They're playing really good football right now. They're leading the AFC East by a landslide in comparison there. But, I mean, you look at the seeding here right now, Sayre, if the playoffs were to begin today, Denver would be the 5th seed here, kind of controlling a little bit of their own destiny. And that's why I think these next couple of games against Baltimore and Kansas City are big, because think about it. You can close the gap and maybe get yourself within that second seed or that 3rd seed range if you can take care of business in these next 2 weeks. I mean, it's going to be a tough task, but certainly for Denver, who has played better on the road, and players have acknowledged that, this is a great opportunity to showcase to the rest of the league, like, hey, you know what? You guys overlooked us this entire season. We're here to compete, and we're here to play.
Yeah, and the great thing for the Broncos right now is that the rest of the AFC is kind of helping them build in a little bit of margin for error, right? Because as you look at the AFC, I have a Tankathon pulled up here, Cody, and you look at the rest of the AFC, it's like who's going to be the team that like creeps up in the second half of the season. There's not even really any teams right now that, okay, this team is 2-6 or 3-5, and they're kind of like working their way back up. Like even the Cincinnati Bengals, like they've beaten bad teams and they've gotten clobbered by a good team. So and they play, I think, the Raiders this week. So they might be ones that get back on track here in the relatively near future. But like the Colts are 4-4. How serious are we taking the Colts right now? And with Anthony Richardson potentially being benched, and I mean, I know you got to take these teams seriously, and each week you just never know, especially with like teams like the Colts playing in the AFC South. That doesn't help the Broncos because they get to play against the Titans and the Jaguars, and they could get some gimme wins in like 13-12 final score games here. But the Broncos do have a bit of a built-in margin for error here, and they have 2 games against Kansas City. So that is really helpful, not to mention the game that they have left against the LA Chargers, who are kind of that one team that's creeping up beneath everybody right now that not really anybody's talking about. People usually love talking about the Chargers, don't they? But I think when you look at the AFC right now, it's pretty straightforward. You got your division leaders, and then you've got a couple of decent teams in the wild card mix. Right now, the Broncos, the Ravens, the Chargers. Other than that, though, it's going to require some teams to make a second half surge. So the Broncos, they seem to be, especially with matchups against teams like the Bengals and, like I mentioned, the Chargers, Chiefs, like they have an opportunity to just take care of business and put themselves back in the postseason for the first time since 2015.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the Baltimore game and obviously Kansas City. You mentioned the divisional matchup left over against the Chargers. Obviously, Denver hoping to even that at 1-1 whenever they do play down the stretch. Week 15, coming off your bye, you're going to host the Indianapolis Colts. Denver still has a matchup late December, second to last game against the Bengals. And obviously a Monday Night Football game on the 2nd of December against the Cleveland Browns. And then obviously another road game against the Raiders. Like Denver's got some games coming up against conference opponents that are at the bottom of the conference right now. Those are must-win games. Even if some of those teams are porous, their record is bad, that's what's going to get you your conference record. That's what's going to give you your tiebreakers over some other teams, especially if some other teams start to drop some conference games here. I mean, you look at it as well. Like I feel like Cincinnati could be that team that does rise up, but I think that division, Sayre, is so tough there in the AFC North right now. Obviously, Pittsburgh and Baltimore are going to be the 2 favorites that are probably going to do that. I don't think Cincinnati's going to claw their way back into it. I don't think Cleveland's going to make noise there. But anytime that those teams play each other, it is a all-out war. And we saw it, look, with the Baltimore Ravens and the Cleveland Browns, who, look, Cleveland got their 2nd win of the year against the Ravens this past week there. Those matchups, they brutalize each other. Like, they beat each other up. There's a lot of bad blood there. That might be a saving grace here, I think, as you go forward here for the Broncos, is that, hey, you do have some of these games that are winnable on the schedule. And if you can beat some of these tougher teams, it's going to amplify, I think, your chances of making it into the postseason, where we've always talked about it. It's about getting to the dance. Even with the return of Tua Tagovailoa, I don't see the Miami Dolphins, as banged up as they are on the defensive side of the ball, with the return of him at Tua on the offensive side of Miami. They still lost to the Arizona Cardinals on a last-second field goal there this past week. Indianapolis, you mentioned, is a great question. We're going to have our AFC squad show a little bit later on here. It's going to premiere on Wednesday. The one thing we are going to talk about, though, is obviously Anthony Richardson tapping himself out of the game because he was tired. Like, that's drawing a lot of conversation around the league. That could mean that Joe Flacco once again finds himself maybe in a position where he upends Anthony Richardson. And who knows, maybe he's going to lead them like kind of like he did the Cleveland Browns last year. The AFC right now, I think, Sayre, is probably going to be the more interesting top-heavy conference right now. The NFC, I think, has a lot of really good teams. When you look at it from the 1st seed to the 7th seed over there, make sure you check out the NFC squad if you're interested in that conversation as well, with all of our Locked On podcast hosts across the board there. I think that Denver's in a good position, and right now they control their destiny. They control their fate. They got to take care of business. That's where it starts and where it ends. But what about the AFC West, though? Broncos country, the Chiefs are obviously on top right now, but what is the gap right now for the Broncos? What is the state of that division as we look at each and every team inside the West? We'll break that down and much more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over there at the FanDuel Sportsbook app. And look, FanDuel, they're giving NFL fans an opportunity to have a big return. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything that you need to place live bets on the NFL as the games are ongoing all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats. You can view live play-by-play and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You can put together same-game parlays. You can put together multi-game parlays, or you can even do anytime touchdown scores across a slate of various NFL games. That's one of my favorite things to do inside of FanDuel Sportsbook. So just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, we'll wrap things up by taking a look at the state of the AFC West. We'll look at who AFC West opponents are playing this week, and more importantly, what the Broncos can do to further maybe a little bit of their lead against the Chargers and the Raiders, and can they close the distance against the Kansas City Chiefs? You'll get that here on today's show. Thanks to all the everydayers and first listeners out there in Broncos country. We appreciate you so much here. Sayre, let's take a look at the state of the AFC West. Obviously, we talked about the Kansas City Chiefs. Right now, they're undefeated at 7-0. I think there's a lot of national conversation right now about Kansas City that you're seeing is like they're not the same Chiefs team. And I certainly, to an extent, I agree. They're not the same Chiefs team, but they are still finding ways to win games and find themselves undefeated. And look, every game for them this year, it hasn't been a blowout really outside of their win, I would say, against the New Orleans Saints. They won that one 26-13. But they beat the 49ers by 10 points. They beat the Raiders 27-20 last week. This week, they're going to host the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It's going to be a late evening game there. And then they're going to take on the Denver Broncos in 2 weeks' time. But then from that point forward, they have a tough road matchup against the Buffalo Bills, obviously one of the top teams in the AFC. At the Carolina Panthers, that should be a win for them. Against the Raiders, should be another win for them. They should probably win against the Los Angeles Chargers in December. They have, I think, the easier road to probably the top schedule, which makes, I think, the Broncos' room for error here, Sayre, a little more difficult. Like Denver doesn't have, I think, one or two games that they could lose and still maybe be in contention for the division. You're a couple of games out right now. That's a great position to be in. But the road for Kansas City simply on paper is a little bit easier than Denver's.
I guess it's good that the Broncos are a good road team this year, Cody, and we've seen that since early in the season. Oh, I guess not the first game of the season, but since pretty early in the season, the Broncos have been good on the road this year, which, I mean, the path to the playoffs kind of has always felt like it would be behind Kansas City for the time being, right? Like they're just a juggernaut that's on autopilot. That's kind of where we're at. Like Kansas City still has a top 10 scoring offense. They still have a top 5 scoring defense, and they're just sleepwalking to those numbers. I mean, I'm not saying they're not good. I'm not saying they're not outstanding in any certain metrics. They're just really great in every area. They convert third downs at a higher rate than pretty much every other team in the NFL. They prevent teams from getting touchdowns in the red zone. Like Kansas City is just good where it matters the most. And that's why they're in the position that they are. Like they're 7-0 because, man, you do the little things so well, you can close out games. Even if Patrick Mahomes is throwing more interceptions than touchdowns, which I believe is still the case to this point.
Yeah.
I haven't checked his stats lately, but I just feel like that's how good this team is. Like they have such a built-in, we talked about it before the season, right? We talked about it last year. Like Kansas City just has such a built-in margin for error with how excellent they are at the details that it was always going to be the wild card conversation for the Broncos. Remember last year, the Broncos crept to within one game of the AFC West, and they could technically still do that. I mean, even if Kansas City wins all their other games, but the Broncos matchups, like the Broncos could kind of conceivably get into the mix there. But I mean, it's always felt like it would be the wild card for the Broncos. And I like that we're seeing this team get tested with some tough road games. Like the Jets are 2-6 going to New York in that, climate, the way that it was that day with the hurricane kind of after effects and things like that, and beating a team that still had aspirations at that point. Like that was a big deal. And the Broncos to go on the road and play the way that they did against New Orleans, which is a top defense this year. Their injuries in New Orleans weren't defensively. So I just think that it's one of those things that, man, this team is getting battle tested on the road, and it's kind of setting up perfectly for them in terms of their playoff hopes as a wild card team.
Yeah, and you look at it as well. Denver's got 5 games left until they hit their bye week in week 14. So it's like, all right, now you come back in December, which is another important month, and you are going to have 4 games. Denver's going to have 2 home games to close out the year, 2 road games, but you're going to have a back-to-back road game series on the road against the Chargers, at Cincinnati, and then a home game against Kansas City, where the stakes for that game will be very interesting when it gets there. Obviously, Indianapolis, you're going to open up after the bye week, but really it goes Baltimore, Kansas City, home against Justin Simmons and the Falcons and Kirk Cousins. And then you have at the Las Vegas Raiders, home Monday Night Football against the Cleveland Browns. I mean, just the stakes are getting a little bit higher here for Denver. That's why these games that are coming up are so crucial, because 1, 2, 4 of their next 5 games are against conference opponents. That right there builds some cushion. Just get in the conversation, because you and I have talked about it. It's not about winning the division. It's about getting to the dance, whether that's as a wild card or whether you find yourself contending for the division. It's another story. If Denver's contending for the division, they're exceeding all expectations at this point, and they're going to surprise a lot of people. They're already exceeding expectations as is. But let's take a look now at the Los Angeles Chargers, who are 1 game behind the Broncos right now, have beaten them. So if they had the same record, the Chargers would technically be in front of Denver due to a virtue of tiebreaker. They're on the road at the Cleveland Browns, which is always a tough place to play, all things considered. Baltimore's found that out. Then they host the Tennessee Titans. Then they host the Cincinnati Bengals. Then they host the Baltimore Ravens. This is where it's like, okay, if Denver starts winning, the Chargers are facing some tough teams coming up, including the Falcons, the Chiefs, and then obviously a little bit of an easier schedule at the end, because it's at New England, at the Raiders to end the year. Denver has to be in a position where they're ahead of the Chargers in the division here at this point for tiebreaker scenarios. And then we can get to the Las Vegas Raiders here, Sarah. I mean, they're on the road this week at Cincinnati. Then they're going to get a bye week, which will be very interesting. Then they're going to open up at the Miami Dolphins. Then they're obviously going to host the Broncos at Kansas City, at Tampa Bay, home against the Falcons. Then they play the Jaguars, at the Saints, and then they close out the season against the Chargers. Right now, they're 2-6. They're having a hard time, 2-4 inside of a conference record right now. Just to swing at things, like they go on a little bit of run, win a few games here, it could change things as well. It's like you can't count some of these teams out. But the AFC right now is going to be a challenge. And right now, it just further solidifies why Denver is in a position to just take care of business as is, go do it, and find yourself in a position to get into the dance at the end of the season. All you need is a ticket, and then you can go dance and anything can happen. But I kind of like where the Broncos are at right now in the state of the AFC West and also in the conference.
I do too. I think they're in good shape to be able to control their own destiny by going out and winning games. Like, you don't want to back into the playoffs. You don't want to, just we can afford to lose this game and we can afford to lose. No, go win these games. Go prove that you belong in these big games, right? I think at this point we can pretty safely say, I know you're a bit more politically correct than I am, Cody. I think the Raiders are cooked. I think the Raiders are done. I think they are one of the worst teams in the NFL. No, and that doesn't mean they can't beat somebody on a given weekend. They beat the Ravens already, so we've seen that. But their quarterback situation, the fact that they already have 2 victories is kind of maybe the best news if you're a Broncos, Chargers, or Chiefs fan, because that might mean that the Raiders miss out on whoever is their top quarterback prospect again in this draft, after we know they really loved Jaden Daniels, his connection to Antonio Pierce and things like that. And it sounds like they may have even liked Bo Nix as well, but I don't think anybody's ready to admit that quite yet. But I think with the Raiders winning 2 games already, they're going to be competing for a top 5 draft pick at the end of this season, and we'll see what that means. Does that mean Travis Hunter, Shedeur? I mean, one of those 2 guys could be wearing silver and black. So I guess no, yeah, it's got to be. It's absolutely. And hey, Travis, he may be able to do that as well, Cody. I don't even know. I haven't seen him try it, but I'm sure he could do it. But I think root for those guys while you still can, fans of the Buffs, because one of them might be going to the Raiders.
Yeah, we'll see how it all plays out, though. One thing is crazy, though, folks. The AFC West is the wild, wild West. What can the Broncos do to maintain their pace? Well, just win, baby. We're pulling the thing out. I feel disgusting saying that, by the way.
I know.
That was, you know what, Broncos country, forgive me. All you got to do is win. That's the thing. We're going to say that. All you got to do is win. I might have to erase that from the show here. Like, I can't believe I just said that. I didn't even notice that. Brutal. Anyways, Broncos country, appreciate you so much for rocking with us here on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. Stay tuned here, obviously on the feed as well. We're going to have the Locked On AFC squad show coming up here on Wednesday. Plus, Sayre is going to sit down with Kevin Ostreicher of Locked On Ravens this week for a crossover Thursday to preview Sunday's big-time AFC showdown, the Broncos' biggest test yet. You can expect that and much more tomorrow and this week here on the Locked On Broncos podcast, Broncos Country. We'll see you then. Just win, baby. Golly, man. Why the heck?
Oh, that's funny.